Thank you so much, Rachel. Just pulling this up for us. So really at its core, with as Rachel said, we have 1,200 English language learners in our program. And what we've looked at is how can we best support specifically our NRS 1 and 2 English language learners in a remote learning environment. And so just to start to give a bit of a overview about why we do what we do. We are a 100% adult ELA program. Again, like Rachel said, serving 1,200 learners annually. But the area that we service in Chicagoland, so we kind of oversee these, are allowed to serve within these three different buckets of Chicagoland. And that covers 1.1 million adults who do not speak English as their primary language at home, and who report speaking English not well. So this 1,200 is just a drop, not even really touching the surface of that, and that's not even the whole span of Chicagoland, and does not represent the whole need of the immigrant English language learner community. And so really this desire to see more distance learning made available, because of how it overcomes so many access barriers when we're able to do it well. And so I'll share in a bit just how our program has ballooned by offering more remote learning options. 65% of those 1,200 learners are in NRS 1 and 2. In previous years, for about 2 decades, 75% of our learners were NRS 1 and 2. So we've spent a bulk amount of our time really learning and growing to serve those learners to the best of our abilities and following best practices in the field. And then 80% of our classes, so 80% of it, we have about 45 different classes that we run, and 80% of them are remote. And then again, that's based on student need, which I'll share more about too. And then really looking to design our remote classes in a way, in all of our classes, but in a way that is really trauma informed, and it focuses on a participatory, access-based language acquisition process, and it really gets after communicative competence. Just to look kind of at where we were and then where we are now, as a program. So in 2021, we had all of our classes in person, and we're just really, digital literacy for us really looked at like just that one slice of hardware operation, and how to navigate technology, but not really looking at a whole scaffolded scope of building digital literacy for digital engagement and digital resilience. And part of that was because there wasn't really a demand or a need in that way at that time to the degree that it is with such urgency today. At that time in 2021, our enrollment numbers were 352. And so then you can see that looking today in 2024, and 2025 is even higher now. So 2024, we hit 1,200 learners, and we're already surpassing that this year. But that's because we've been able to reach an untapped English language learner community where the majority of the students coming to our online classes had never accessed an English language class before, because the in-person options had too many barriers. But then looking at the ability to now access language classes remotely, we're also in an entirely different landscape than we were even in 2021, looking at just what the pandemic did even to digitizing the world, really kind of on steroids, and really overnight. And so the acceleration of online healthcare, online work, online school processes, and for our learners, children's schools to even be able to access and communicate with their teachers now in such a remote way. When we could just get on a phone before, now what does it look like to instruct our students and how to navigate and a whole community online? And so when we've looked at classroom design for distance learning, and with 65% being NRS 1 and 2 in that remote learning environment, how do we equip them to navigate such a digitized world? And so that's what we have spent the last several years trying to build out in our remote learning classes, desiring to keep remote because there's such a strong population there and a need there, but then saying, well, then we need to learn to do it well, not just English language acquisition well, but really building toward that digital resiliency. And so just this case for distance learning, I'm not going to read all of this to you, but can make this available later. But just really, as we were grappling with the ability to come back in person post-pandemic or remain online, asking this question of our preference would be in person because that's what we know. But all of our students are begging for us to stay online and to continue to expand online. And so looking at the cultural, financial, family commitments and limitations that our students, many of our immigrant learners face, and how many of them are working 1, 2, 3 jobs in addition to taking multiple English classes, coming in person was a barrier and is still a barrier that they cannot overcome. And so having a remote option has been um, the only option for them. And really looking at this desire to then serve the community through distance learning classes, but then build in multiple literacy development in that space, including digital literacy skills. And so as we stayed online, we had to then come to grips also with this ELL divide that we saw happening during the pandemic. It just kind of accentuated and exacerbated in this now limited access to programming, limited access to supports with no access to devices or inadequate devices, which we'll talk about in a bit, limited Wi-Fi or not the strength of Wi-Fi that's needed to maintain an online class, access to training and supports on how to use these different resources. And then just so many social realms moving digital that made isolation and an ability to access community resources all the more difficult. And so wanting to say, if we're continuing in our distance learning and really making that a big part of our programming, we have to address all of these barriers that our students are facing, both to in-person and online language classrooms, and to access within the community to then actually put that language into practice to actually help them with their lives. And so that question then is, how do we address those barriers to equitable access? And the two things that we came away with was that digital literacy skills should not be a barrier to the remote classroom. So we have to address that. And language skills should never be a barrier to the classroom. And oftentimes language skills for both in-person and online classes are a barrier to accessing a language class, which should not be the case. But for NRS 1 and 2 learners, that is often the case, and it impedes their ability to join any language class. And so we'll talk about the ways in which we have worked to overcome that barrier through translanguaging efforts and communication with our learners and the community. So what does online learning at World Relief look like right now? We have synchronous Zoom classes with digital interactives using things like WordWall, Kahoots, and Seesaw has become a really big part of our program. We have morning, afternoon, evening, and weekend classes to address the shift work schedules of our learners so that they can come home from their first, second job, and instead of driving a distance or finding transportation access, they can just open up their iPads and join their classes. We use level-specific resources, Step Forward, Burlington English, and Ventures for specific levels for specific purposes. And in the breakout session, we can talk more about why we've chosen these different resources and for which levels, and also how we use digital interactives. We have an IT specialist and a digital literacy specialist with specific goals in order to serve specifically these NRS 1 and 2 learners, all of our learners, but really a bulk of our focus is on NRS 1 and 2 so that they can be on-ramped into this distance learning environment and gain transferable skills as they grow in their language skills to take with them to other language learning partners or as they scale up in our programming. And we have student success coaches that work with transition support and do a lot of stress coaching to navigate trauma responses that occur in the classroom setting remotely and in person, but looking at really developing tools to help learners online in the classroom when language learning on its own brings about stress, how to help learners navigate that so they can continue to learn. Additionally, all of our bridge classes, so our contextualized career-specific classes, are also remote. And then 80% of our NRS 1 classes are remote. In order to do this and feel like we're doing it well, and there's still a lot that we have to learn, but this is kind of where we're at right now. We found that resourcing both the instructor and the student are key. And so we ensure that our instructors, as they're navigating a Zoom room of 30 students, have not only their laptop, but they also have an external monitor. So they can see all of their students on one screen and navigate their teaching resources on another. They also have a document camera and an iPad. The iPad allows them to join their class from a different device so that when they put up breakout room discussions or prompts, they can then join each breakout room from a different device and keep up the prompts. And then we provide supplemental resources and digital interactives, which I can again talk about more in the breakout session. But Seesaw, we were using WhatsApp as the main means of communication with our learners because it's such a known entity. And so familiar, especially even with those who don't have strong digital literacy skills. Um, but because of its current and increasingly concerning cybersecurity issues, and because there isn't an app that can be used on an iPad. It's a third-party app, which brings a lot of, again, security concerns. We've switched to Seesaw as a main tool of communication as a school, but then also for instructor-student communication. And then we leverage interpretation so that we can ensure for intentional purposes that learners are, that the general flow of a class, the attendance policies, the days off, the way that we're going to communicate with one another, all of these core components and what it means to learn a language, what the language learning process is like, what our different program offerings are at World Relief. We offer those with interpretation so that those don't become a barrier or impede the learning process, so that it's not every day for the first couple of months of class that a teacher is trying to pantomime, how to communicate through Seesaw with their students. But we can just one time in native language communicate these pieces and move forward because there is clear understanding. And so not wanting other elements of learning to be a barrier to actually starting the language learning process. And then for resourcing students, again, that Zoom, Canvas for our higher level classes, our core text or resource that we're using for that level, Seesaw, tech hardware, and then weekly tech support appointments, and again, interpretation. One of the things that has driven our technology lending library, which I'll talk about next, is looking at the devices that then our students have and device ownership. And seeing that just across the board, as a refugee resettlement agency, this really aligns true for us too. This research that was done by IOM, in that 80% of those refugee populations who were studied had a mobile phone, but only 6% had a tablet, or 14% had a laptop computer, and really finding just the need for language learning in a distance learning environment with NRS-1 for it not to happen on the phone. And while in dire circumstances or with very limited funding, and if that is the only means to learn a language, we can navigate some of those challenges, but knowing that to learn a language well and engage with the language learning process, which is very collaborative and community driven, really wanting students to be on a tablet or a computer. And not on their phones. So for NRS 1 and 2, we have required that students use one of our devices, which has meant that we have needed to spend the last several years building up a technology lending library. And so we have, since 2018, slowly starting to build our lending library, and with all of our different kind of funding allowances in different spaces, getting really creative to build out a lending library, which now has over 520 iPads that we've reserved about 50 for CASAS testing. And then we use a Mosul management system to manage all of those iPads and really curate each class. Each online class then has a subset of apps that are specific for that teacher and for that level, and then they can all be managed in that space. There are also about 100 Chromebooks, 80 hotspots, and then we also have a pocket of laptops that we use, again, very intentionally with our higher level learners. The Chromebooks also are for NRS 3 and 4, and laptops for 5 and 6. And it's very purposeful, and even that building of their hardware skills and moving from a very user-friendly interface that is familiar, like an iPad, into the space of a laptop. We also offer interpreted technology orientations as the devices and hotspots are loaned. And then we offer weekly tech appointments through Microsoft Bookings links that our IT specialist mans and has interpretation as necessary by level. But if students are hitting barriers during the class time or errors on their devices or something's not working, their teacher reminds them of this tech appointment that's available in CSAT also, that they can go and make an appointment to then take in their device and ask for help from our IT specialist. And then the thing that has really been the biggest boost to our retention have been these digital literacy intensives that we have now been requiring for all of our NRS 1 and 2 level learners joining distance learning classes. And so in order to take an online class with us, we at registration then sign the learner up for these distance learning intensives and tell them that they are required, and there is interpretation, and that is when they will be loaned their device, and they're required at NRS 1 and 2 to use one of our iPads so that there's uniformity in the classroom. And the teacher knows that when I put up a word wall activity, it's going to look exactly the same on every student's device. It won't be appearing differently for different students based on the device they're using. And then the digital literacy specialist navigates this 3-hour in-person training to walk through how to use the iPad, how to change the camera, how to mute yourself, how to navigate Zoom, how to use a QR code to pull up your class, and navigating potential errors and technical difficulties that may occur day to day on an iPad or in the Zoom space. Also navigating Seesaw and how to communicate with your instructor in those spaces, and then just basically how to be an online student and what that means and what it doesn't mean. And so oftentimes we also learned that it's not enough to tell our students what the best practices are in a learning environment, but also what not to do. And so in a lot of those orientations and training times, helping our learners see what it looks like to create a learning space in their home. Just like we've worked really hard to create a classroom environment that facilitates learning and is trauma informed, even in the way that we limit distractions and high sensory things all around us. That will also limit stress. And so we encourage our students not to cook or drive while they're in class. And we really paint that in their native language to help them understand what this will do for them and allow for them in that space so they're ready to succeed on day one. And then after that 3-hour in-person orientation training, then they go online with that digital literacy specialist for an hour the next day and practice all those things they just learned and engaged with in that in-person environment. And then the missing link that we have found with all of this is multilingualism. And so really just kind of going back to that initial piece of looking at the barriers to access, and whether it's in person or online, that a student's language level should never be a barrier to accessing language classes. And that digital literacy skills should never be a barrier to accessing language classes. And so that is where we have integrated multilingualism into both a space of building those initial skills to access the digital classroom, and then embedded in all of the environments, both in person and online, but really blown out in that online environment, how to utilize native language interpretation for those key building components to launch the class off with success and to support the learner. And so the ways that we incorporate multilingualism in this distance learning environment are from the very beginning, both from the recruitment process, the intake, assessment, orientation, and all the way through to their class time first days. And so we interpret our flyers, we provide interpretation at intake, and then even in the assessment space of navigating a CASAS test with the learner, but instructing them that in order to do this, your children cannot give you the answers. And if you don't know what to do, hit the I don't know. And so walking through in an interpreted space how to take this test, instead of trying to mime with an NRS one who has zero language skills, what to do with this test, and what is happening when they hear something repeated, and why they can't click the right answer at that moment. They have to wait. And so navigating all of these things that shouldn't be a barrier and should be are meant to be in place to help us accurately place students, put them in the right classes, helping students know where they've been enrolled, and knowing that I'm placing you in a class that actually works with your schedule and with your time. And we can only do that if we are utilizing native language supports. And then that's kind of where pairing those two together, digital skills and multilingualism, is how we have been able to overcome many access barriers. And we have seen our retention of our NRS 1 and 2 learners who have gone through our distance learning programming move from 40% to 80%. And so that retention rate, it then also mirrors with an increase in EFL gains because they're able to access the class more effectively every time. And that in turn is building digital resilience as we are also simultaneously embedding scaffolded digital literacy skills throughout our thematic units throughout the course, building from level to level. So ensuring that as a student moves through our program, the complexity of their digital literacy skills are building at the same time, which is also part of that piece of moving from an iPad to a Chromebook to a laptop, but then also as they're navigating different types of forms online, as they're navigating and learning how to be safe users of internet, and how that's building in complexity. And all of that moves toward increased EFL gains. And we can also see MSGs in terms of even upskilling opportunities that learners have because their digital skills are growing and their ability to navigate as digital citizens this entire environment. And really that core driving goal of multilingualism as being seeing the students' native language and all they bring to the table as an asset. And so pulling on student knowledge is huge in this space. Even pulling on their knowledge of how to navigate a smartphone, if they have that, and transferring that into that iPad space. And so transferability and looking at the skills they have is a huge part along the journey for every step of the process. And really just making intentional steps to on-ramp learners to the ELA learning path. Oftentimes without that native language literacy support, the native language interpretation support to help students understand what we're offering and what they will gain from this NRS 1 distance learning class, many of our learners think that this one instructor they have in this one Zoom class is the only class that is offered by World Relief. And so that also can make language learning, which already feels like an abyss, feel even more isolating or limiting. And so being able to utilize multilingualism and digital skill supports to show the entire trajectory and the learning pathway for our students that we have available. And also all of the different community resources and community partners we have to build out to really meet all of our students' needs. And so just as I said, to date, in FY25, we've had 172 level 1 students borrow a device and receive orientation. And then we have had similar numbers with our level 2 learners as well. And we've had 70% EFL gains for our NRS learners in that distance learning environment. And our retention rate has increased from 40% to 80% for those NRS students who did receive a device and that distance learning intensive from us. And just to kind of close on a story of success that we've seen as we have implemented these digital literacy intensives for our students joining distance learning environments. We've had many students who have been in our program in an NRS classroom for years, and they've been in online classes since 2021 when they first started. And repeatedly, the instructors have talked about how they've just seen no gains, and every day has just been a challenge where there's been technology error after technology error, barrier after barrier. And the student just remained in that class year over year. But then once we started these distance learning intensives, the student came in August for their first week of class, and the teacher was astounded and said, "This is a completely different student." And the student came out of that first week of class and said, "I actually know what's going on now. I understand," and became a full participant in the class, never fell off the call again. And just to see now how they are making gains and moving through the process of true language acquisition because we have removed these barriers to access through all of these different support systems, and we've made distance learning, which was the only option for this learner, actually accessible and effective.